This story is about a girl named Jin-hye. She lived with her father and her mother had passed away. In fact, Jin-hye's father could provide for her and they lived happily. Jin-hye loved her father very much because, after her mother's death, he was the only one she had. The only parent who can give her the attention and affection she needed. As time passes, Jin-hye's father eventually remarried a woman. One day, Jin-hye was traveling with her father to someplace. They took a bus and then stopped at a cake store to buy a cake, but after that, her father instead took her to a big house. Jin-hye was confused because there were so many children there. Apparently, without her realizing it, the place they went to was an orphanage and her father planned to leave her there. Jin-hye was then taken around by the sisters and were introduced to the other children, but Jin-hye didn't say a word. She left the class and was sad when she saw her father had left her without saying anything to her. The cake she thought was for her turned out to be a cake for the other kids so that they would accept her, but still, she was bullied by other children. Jin-hye still believed that her father will come back to pick her up, and even the sisters there cannot persuade Jin-hye, who chose to stay outside instead of going inside the class. However, because of hunger, at night, Jin-hye had no other choice but to return to the kitchen to get something to eat, but unfortunately, the cake left for her was eaten by other children. The sisters finally found her unconscious in the kitchen. The next day, in the morning, when the children were having breakfast, Jin-hye once again made a scene. She even threw the food that had been prepared for her and got scolded by the caretaker there named Bomo for wasting the food. She was told to clean up the mess she made before she could go anywhere. When Suk-hye, one of the children in that orphanage, saw that, she immediately offered to help Jin-hye to clean up the mess. Suk-hye told Jin-hye to stop acting like a child and said that this was not her home. After that incident, Jin-hye met the head of the orphanage and asked him to contact her father. She couldn't accept that her father left her in the orphanage because she is not an orphan. She was upset because after her father took him for a walk and gave her new clothes, he was abandoned. Didn't get any solution from the head of the orphanage, Jin-hye was desperate to leave the place. She climbed the gate and tried to escape. Jin-hye's recklessness became a spectacle for the children who were there. Bomo then decided to open the gate so that Jin-hye would climb down because it was too dangerous. She even let Jin-hye leave if it was she really wanted to. After everyone left, Jin-hye climbed down the gate and left the orphanage, but of course, she didn't know where to go. In the end, Jin-hye decided to return and eat the leftover rice in the kitchen because she hadn't had anything to eat since morning. At night, Jin-hye, who just came out of the toilet, accidentally saw Suk-hye cleaning a menstrual pad. Jin-hye immediately left from there. After Suk-hye found her in the room, she threatened to hurt Jin-hye if she leaked about it. The next morning, Jin-hye went with the other children to the church. In the church, for the first time, Jin-hye finally followed the orphanage rules. After they came back from the church, Bomo cut Jin-hye's hair while advising her not to be stubborn. Bomo said that Jin-hye had to learn good manners so she could be adopted by someone, but Jin-hye still said that she wouldn't go anywhere because her father would pick her up someday. Jin-hye still didn't realize that she had been abandoned by her own father and still hoped that her father would come back for her. One day, Jin-hye was taken to take a medical test conducted by a doctor at the orphanage. Jin-hye underwent a checkup, had her eyes checked, and had her blood tested. Sometime later, the doctor asked why she ended up in the orphanage. Jin-hye then explained that one day, her father came home with her new stepmother and brought a newborn baby. When her father and stepmother were having dinner, she was told to look after the baby, but when she tried to hold the baby, she accidentally stuck a needle and made the baby cry loudly. She thought that was the reason she was left in the orphanage. Listening to that, the doctor tried to comfort Jin-hye and said that her father wanted her to live with someone better than himself. Days passed and Jin-hye finally started to befriend other kids. She started to get along with Suk-hye. Jin-hye asked why she couldn't tell anyone about what she saw that night. Suk-hye said that no one would adopt her if they knew that she had had her period. It turned out that Suk-hye had been living there for a long time without finding foster parents who wanted to adopt her, but she said that there was another person that had lived there longer than she. Her name is Yi-shin. One day, Suk-hye and Jin-hye accidentally overheard the conversation between Bomo and Yi-shin. Yi-shin refused to get adopted if only to end up as a maid in someone else's house, but Bomo said that Yi-shin couldn't stay in the orphanage forever, especially with her disability. She should be grateful if someone decided to adopt her, but still, Yi-shin refused the decision. Jin-hye and Suk-hye became close friends. They even often sneaked in at night to eat cake in the kitchen. Suk-hye told that all this time, she did not know about her father at all. She was put in her aunt's house since she was a baby until she was finally put in the orphanage. Suk-hye said that if they were adopted by someone, their life would be fun, but Jin-hye once again said that she would not leave the orphanage. The next day, they all bid their farewell to their friend who was adopted by someone. A future that maybe Jin-hye would get, but she still didn't want to go. At some point, Jin-hye and Suk-hye saw Yi-shin giving a love letter to a young man who often came to the orphanage. Seemed like Yi-shin hoped that someone else would marry her so that she didn't have to end up as someone's maid. The next day, the young man came again to look for Yi-shin. He left a reply letter for Yi-shin to Suk-hye and Jin-hye because Yi-shin was away at that time. At night, when Yi-shin came back, Jin-hye gave the letter. Initially, Yi-shin was happy to get a reply to the letter, but seeing her expression when reading the letter, they all knew that Yi-shin's love was rejected by the young man. One day, there was a couple from America named Mr. and Mrs. Spencer. Their arrival attracted the attention of Suk-hye, who tried to greet them. During the introductory session, Suk-hye confidently introduced herself and told them her goals, but this couple was also interested in the newly arrived Jin-hye, but Jin-hye chose to keep silent and refused to introduce herself. One day, Jin-hye and Suk-hye saw Yi-shin leaving the orphanage, but when asked where she was going, she instead didn't say anything and left from there. Until midnight, she finally returned. Bomo immediately asked her where she went away that whole day, but Yi-shin kept her mouth shut and didn't want to talk at all. The next morning, Yi-shin was unconscious and was immediately taken to the hospital by Bomo and the sisters. Of course, Suk-hye and Jin-hye didn't know what Yi-shin had done. The other day, Mr. and Mrs. Spencer came back to the orphanage and wanted to meet Suk-hye and Jin-hye. During their meeting, Suk-hye confidently answered any questions given to her with a happy smile, but Jin-hye still didn't want to talk and didn't want to look at them. After the meeting, Suk-hye was confused by Jin-hye's behavior, because if she behaved, one of them might end up being adopted by them, but Jin-hye was still with her stance not to leave the orphanage and still wanted to wait for her father. Suk-hye tried to offer Jin-hye to ask Mr. Spencer and his wife to take them both, but before Jin-hye could even answer, Yi-shin showed up. In front of the residents of the orphanage, Yi-shin apologized for the scene she had made and would accept the life that God had destined for her. Finally, Yi-shin accepted her fate to be adopted by someone, even if it was to becoming a maid in their house. One day, Suk-hye was brought back to the orphanage after going out with Mr. and Mrs. Spencer. Turned out, Suk-hye was told to study English every day. Suk-hye once again offered Jin-hye to convince Mr. and Mrs. Spencer to adopt them both, and Jin-hye finally agreed to the offer, so, the next day, Suk-hye would try to ask Mr. Spencer about it. To prepare for it, Suk-hye taught Jin-hye some of the knowledge she got, but sadly, the next morning, Jin-hye waited until the afternoon, but Suk-hye did not return to the orphanage. The sisters said that Suk-hye would stay at Mr. and Mrs. Spencer's house to get closer to them. Of course, that made Jin-hye lonely because Suk-hye was the only friend she had at the orphanage. The next morning, Suk-hye, who had just returned, apologized to Jin-hye because she couldn't convince Mr. Spencer to adopt Jin-hye. That morning, Suk-hye was finally taken away from the orphanage by Mr. and Mrs. Spencer. After losing her only friend in the orphanage, Jin-hye returned to being the Jin-hye she used to be. Jin-hye again asked the head of the orphanage for help to contact her father, but the head of the orphanage said that Jin-hye's father did not leave his phone number. Jin-hye then gave her address so that the head of the orphanage could bring her back to her father. Jin-hye returned to being a lonely, emotional, and stubborn child. She even destroyed the gifts given to her. She ended up being scolded by Bomo. Jin-hye was then taught how to vent her emotions by hitting blankets that were drying in the sun, so at least, she could do something productive with her anger. The next time Jin-hye was called by the head of the orphanage, she was informed that her father no longer lived at the address that she gave. The head of the orphanage didn't know where her father moved. Jin-hye was then told to learn some manner so that someone would come and adopt her. She couldn't accept that her father really had abandoned her. Since then, she went to the bush near the orphanage building alone and dug a hole every day. She did it until the hole became big enough to bury herself. One day, when the residents of the orphanage went to the church, Jin-hye didn't join them and pretended to be sick. When everyone was gone, Jin-hye went into the bushes and tried to bury herself in there as if planning to disappear without a trace. She had enough of everything and couldn't hold her anger much longer, so she tried to do something that could treat her sadness and get rid of her anger. Jin-hye tried to cover her whole body with dirt, but she discouraged that intention because it turned out that suicide was not as simple as she imagined. She also abandoned her intention, and instead he buried all her frustration and anger there. Jin-hye chose to move on, leaving her past and forgetting his father's promise. There was no way he would come back for her. She tried to face the future and decided to accept being adopted. One day, the head of the orphanage gave a photo of the foster parents who wanted to adopt Jin-hye. They were a husband and wife from France. Without thinking twice, Jin-hye agreed. In short, with the help of Bomo, she prepared her things to take to France. For the last time, Bomo asked Jin-hye to sing for her. Unexpectedly, after months of dealing with Jin-hye's stubbornness, Bomo finally parted ways with her. The next day, all the residents of the orphanage bid their farewell to Jin-hye by taking a photo together. She was then taken to the airport by car. After living a hard life at the orphanage, finally, Jin-hye was going to have a new life. When on the plane, Jin-hye realized that she would never meet her father again. She then imagined how nice it was when she sat behind his father and hugged him as they rode a bicycle together, but that was all over because Jin-hye would live in another country with her foster parents. Arriving at the airport in France, Jin-hye was ready to be greeted by her foster parents who were already waiting for her.